OPB Podcasts.
Live from the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, November 6th. National attention has focused recently on an immigration and customs enforcement facility in Portland, but ICE's reach goes far beyond that boarded-up building, and arrests have surged in the last month. And after months of preparation and the creation of a bunch of new shelters, Portland is now enforcing a ban on street camping. That means tickets and possible arrests for the city's homeless residents. It's a bit of a grab bag today on the podcast. I'm OPB politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
I'm Portland City politics reporter Alex Zielinski.
I'm suburban communities reporter Holly Bartholomew.
Great to have you both with us. Before we start, I want to note we are streaming this live on OPB's YouTube page and on opb.org. If anyone watching has a question about these topics or other political issues in the region, shoot us a note in the chat. We will try to answer them. Holly, I want to start with you, though. For the last several weeks, you have been sort of intensely covering ICE arrests that appear to be growing more and more frequent in the Portland Metro and Willamette Valley. What are the kinds of enforcement actions we've seen? Just paint a picture for folks of like the gamut that this runs.
Right. So detainments have definitely picked up over the past few weeks, and we're seeing them kind of all over the place. We've seen them at homes and job sites, outside schools, and even in the middle of the street. And one of the things that we've been seeing, particularly just in the past couple of weeks, is that they seem to be growing increasingly aggressive. We're seeing agents breaking car windows to take people out of their cars. We've also seen a couple of pretty intense apartment raids out in Gresham. I was at a press conference yesterday with a number of immigrant advocacy groups, and they said they are seeing more and more people who are hospitalized during their ICE arrests because of this increasing aggression.
Wow. You know, and we have known, right, since President Trump was elected, that immigration enforcement would be this massive focus. He ran on it, literally, right? That didn't translate immediately, at least didn't seem to the kind of activity we are seeing lately. I mean, what do we know about why these detainments, these arrests have begun increasing? Is there any obvious reason here?
Yeah, so, I mean, what we saw is that they really picked up around early to mid-October. There was a 4-day period in the middle of October where the Portland Immigrants' Rights Coalition, which is a hotline for people to report sightings of ICE as well as ICE arrest, they reported 550 calls in just that 4-day period, whereas before that, they were seeing about 700 calls a month. So it was a pretty significant increase, and it hasn't slowed down since.
The Rapid Response Network has tracked more than 300 detentions in October alone, including at least 30 people detained in a single day last week in Woodburn. These detentions have been violent, warrantless, and have terrorized our communities and our loved ones.
That was Isa Pena. She was the policy director at Innovation Law Lab at yesterday's press conference. But you also asked why we're seeing this now. Yeah. And for that, I don't really have a great answer. One thing is that the Big Beautiful Bill, which passed earlier this summer, gave an extra $170 billion or so to ICE and Border Patrol. So we might just be seeing that hit ICE budgets now. We also know the administration has been just pushing hard for more and more deportations. But we still don't know exactly why they choose when to target and where they target. We do know, though, that Trump seemed to turn his attention to Portland around the start of October. That's when this fight over National Guard federalization began. So maybe Portland's just been on his mind since then.
Yeah, maybe. And, you know, one thing that is clear is that this stepped-up enforcement is having a lot of impact. It's inspired a whole range of reactions, as you've covered, from folks who are pushing back. One story that was really notable, you recently spent an early morning, I think, in Hillsborough tagging along with some teachers. Why were you out there?
Right. So Hillsborough has been one of the areas hardest hit by all of this increase in ICE activity. A parent was actually arrested right outside Eastwood Elementary School in Hillsborough a couple of weeks ago, right after dropping off their student. Parents and teachers in that area have also reported seeing ICE patrolling the neighborhood in the mornings. So these teachers just kind of started putting themselves out there in the neighborhood to be on the lookout for ICE and to try and make students and families feel safer as they made their way to school.
Well, and one thing your reporting shows, right, is kids, I mean, there's evidence kids are not feeling safe and their families are not feeling safe sending them to school. Those fears might be especially keen, I think, at schools like Poynter and Eastwood, the schools that you were sort of focused on.
Right. So the week that parent was arrested, the Hillsborough School District saw a pretty significant drop in attendance. Like we said, these students and families just aren't feeling safe making their way to school. And that's what prompted these morning ICE watches. But other than attendance, teachers that I spoke with have also said they see signs of stress in their students. One middle school English teacher said she was seeing students kind of processing how all of this impacts them in their writing for class. But at the same time, it's not just the trip to school that has people fearful. We're seeing people who are staying home from work and just avoiding leaving their house altogether. But like we said, these fears do seem to be particularly prominent around Hillsborough and particularly Eastwood and Poynter, which is the middle school in that same neighborhood, where there is a fairly large share of Hispanic and Latino families. But it's also, Hillsborough's not the only place seeing these trends. We've seen quite an uptick in Woodburn and Gresham as well, where there are also pretty diverse populations. And ICE has also been reported seen at or near schools in Woodburn and Gresham as well.
Back to the sort of teacher patrols. I mean, I'm curious what the thinking is here. It is hard for me to imagine ICE agents aggressively swooping in a morning and some teachers standing around being necessarily a deterrent, but maybe the thinking is they might be. I don't know. When you spoke with them, how did they sort of envision it?
So as far as I know, it hasn't come to that yet. But the idea is just kind of to create a safe zone of people there to protect students and just kind of an area of friendly faces. I imagine that if agents were targeting a specific person, that they could make their way through a pair of teachers and parents. But it seems like that's not the type of enforcement we're seeing. It's not that targeted going after specific people. They're just kind of stopping people in immigrant neighborhoods who they suspect could be here illegally. And as we've seen, they don't always get that right. We've heard of a few cases of people with legal status getting arrested. But what the teachers told me is that the ICE vehicles they've seen in the neighborhood around Eastwood and Poynter tend to get out of there when they see the teachers and parents out there.
Yeah, there was a quote in your story that they just don't seem to want to be around teachers. So maybe it really does work. These patrols are just one way communities are responding to this stepped-up enforcement. As you mentioned, you were at a press conference this week. There's been a whole variety of responses. There's also lawsuits over this, right? Or at least a lawsuit over the stepped-up enforcement.
So in addition to the teachers patrols, we've seen all sorts of mutual aid networks spring into action that are bringing food to families who are afraid to leave their homes or helping cover costs for people who've had their primary breadwinner arrested by ICE. And as you mentioned, we've also seen a legal fight against all of this. Last month, a number of immigrant advocacy groups sued DHS and ICE, claiming that lawyers for people arrested by ICE have not been able to make contact with their clients before they're transferred out of state. Also this week in Washington County, the county commission declared a state of emergency over all of this.
Well, and you mentioned citizens who've been swept up in this. You covered the case of Victor Cruz, whose family has been very forceful in demanding his release or his situation being remedied. Can you just explain a little bit about that?
So Victor Cruz, he's lived in Hillsborough for the past 30 years, and he had a work permit and a pending visa application. So he had a legal right to be here, but he was arrested earlier in October, and he's been in detention in Tacoma ever since. And his family, friends in the area, and even a number of elected elected officials have been calling for his release.
So here legally, but has been swept up and is now in detention. You have also asked ICE about all this stuff. What do they say when I don't know how many times you've sent them inquiries. I know they've gotten back to you at least some. What do they say about all this?
So I guess starting with the lawsuit, in response to that suit, they actually put some of the blame on the city of Portland, which has rules about how long people can be kept detained at the ICE facility here. Because Portland says people can't be there for more than 12 hours, ICE says it has no choice but to take detainees quickly to the detention center in Tacoma. I also asked ICE about their presence around schools, which were previously off limits to immigration enforcement, actually. And they told me that they were protecting the schools from criminal aliens and gang members who were taking advantage of that previous policy. But the schools I talked to definitely pushed back and said there was no merit to this and no evidence of any gang activity or crime around their schools.
Yeah, I think one teacher you quoted said they have faulty information if they think that they are protecting us. Very interesting, though, about that land use condition on the ICE facility in the 12 hours, because that is something the city of Portland has really been leaning on to say, we're going to put some penalties against you, ICE. And at the same time, they're saying, well, okay, we're just going to be sweeping people out of the state very quickly. And that's not great, maybe, for the attorneys representing these people. Okay, that is one big enforcement story happening in Oregon right now. There's another one that is shaping up in Portland I want to touch on. Alex, for the first time, I think, under Mayor Keith Wilson's tenure, the city of Portland, since Saturday, I believe, is now enforcing a ban on street camping.
Yeah, like you said, they went into effect last weekend on November 1st. And yeah, police have begun issuing citations and carrying out the law.
And I know we've talked about this policy before. I think it's been a while. Remind us exactly what this law does.
Sure. So it prohibits people from camping in a tent or living out of a vehicle on public property, like a sidewalk, a street, a park, unless reasonable shelter is available. If shelter is not available, the policy limits what people can do while camping. For instance, they can't dig into the ground or start a fire or block access to private property, other activities in city land. And people who refuse to leave or refuse to move into a shelter will be given a citation that comes with a fine of up to $100 or up to a week in jail.
This has been on the books since May of last year. It went into effect right away. I think it was being enforced a little bit under Mayor Wheeler, but Mayor Wilson has been waiting to enforce it since he arrived at City Hall in January. Help us understand that thinking.
Yeah, so he hit pause on enforcement in February. I think January there was a few citations given, but he basically said, let's pump the brakes. You'll remember, and our viewers, listeners will remember, that he entered office with this big promise to end unsheltered homelessness by quickly opening up hundreds of new shelter beds across the city. And he wanted some time to open those shelters before cracking down on camping. He now believes that he has enough shelter available to enforce this policy. As a quick refresher, Wilson now has opened about 1,000 shelter beds since January. These are beds in overnight-only congregate shelters, which is a name for the type of shelter with large open rooms with rows of beds.
Yep.
The addition of these beds brings Multnomah County's total shelter bed count to around 3,500, which is still less than half of the estimated number of people living unsheltered in the county. But Wilson's argument is about vacancy. The new shelters he's opened have pretty high vacancy rates, and he says that means he can start enforcing the ban since there are beds available.
Yeah, there's state law that talks about reasonable enforcement, and so maybe if there's places for these people to go, they can do this. And, let's be honest. I mean, you and I have talked about there is a fair amount of suspicion that for all the high-mindedness of Mayor Wilson's policy and talk on homelessness, his push for shelter is little more than ensuring there's enough space that he can straight-facedly get people off the streets with this policy and avoid maybe a lawsuit that would go against him. I think you've asked him about this. Mm-hmm. What does he say about it?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because people talk about it like it's kind of this cloak and dagger thing, but Wilson has been pretty clear from the start that this is the plan. He's just used different words to talk about it. That he wants to open shelter beds to start quote, enforcing community standards. That's kind of the framing, which is his way of saying ticketing people for living outside. I talked with Wilson a couple weeks ago, maybe days ago, I don't remember, about the shelter plan. And I asked him specifically if the high vacancy rates at these overnight shelters tells him that something's wrong with them, right? That people don't want to go into them. Like maybe he needs to change something. And I asked if they're not meeting people's needs. Here's how he responded.
Yeah, no, that's a positive. I've told my team I need hundreds of empty beds every night. Having a system with no empty beds means our system fails.
So this is certainly the most maybe enthusiastic and kind of straightforward that he's been around wanting empty beds since entering office. And it's an interesting argument that having empty beds is a sign of his shelters working as a tool to enforce the camping policy.
Well, and let's get to what this might look like. I think you said up top, violating this law is supposed to be punishable with a citation. Maybe you get a $100 fine, maybe not. Sure. Not arrest. But that doesn't mean that people won't be arrested as the city enforces this.
Right. Yeah. Under the system, people who violate the policy will get a citation, a ticket that essentially just has a date on it for when people have to show up to court. But if people skip that court date, which is pretty common in the kind of unhoused community, you don't have stability or schedules necessarily the same way that someone in a house does. If you skip that date, it's likely a bench warrant that'll go out for them, and that means an arrest. I should mention the city says it's also going to be checking people for warrants for any other charges as they begin to enforce this policy at different camps. So we'll probably see more arrests more generally as this rolls out. And
that's just one piece of it, right? But there's also a court system to consider. That you mentioned bench warrants. This all gets cycled through the courts. Are Multnomah County's courts able to handle an influx like this? What do you hear from that corner?
It doesn't seem like it. I spoke with the top judge who oversees the criminal courts, and he made it seem like anyone cited under this policy may be delayed a long time before even making it before a judge. That's because of the county's public defender shortage, which I think we've probably spoken about on this podcast before, but there's just not enough public defenders available to represent people who can't afford an attorney in Multnomah County. I think there's 1,000 people still on a waiting list for an attorney right now. And so people charged with low-level crimes like this often have to wait weeks, months before being assigned a lawyer. I also spoke with Grant Hartley with Metropolitan Public Defenders. That's one of the 2 public defense firms in Multnomah County. He said that it's not just a public defense shortage, it's also a shortage in judges and court staff. And here's how he described the impact of adding a new citation charge into the mix.
You are adding even more work to an already overburdened, under-resourced system. It is just going to exacerbate all of the issues that have already come about as a result of that.
So all that's to say is I can't imagine this running through the courts smoothly.
I mean, I think one thing that was just really striking when you wrote a story about how this might work recently is that people don't seem to have an idea how it might work.
Yeah. A lot of this policy is just really backed by good intentions and maybe some magical thinking, not a lot of substance right now. Days before it was going to go into effect and be enforced, the mayor's office told me they still didn't have any standard operating procedures in place for how police should roll out enforcement, and that there's no hard and fast definition for also what reasonable shelter is, which is a key piece of their policy, which is the way that they can enforce this rule in the first place.
And then there's this other question of whether this leads to a lawsuit. We have referenced a number of times this state law that allows houseless people to sue if cities have policies that aren't reasonable. I mean, that's what happened when Portland passed a former version of this camping ban. It got sort of blocked in court. Do we have a sense whether legal action is likely as we presumably see this enforced more and more?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't tell. But I have talked with attorneys at the Oregon Law Center. That's the legal nonprofit who sued the city on behalf of homeless Portlanders previously and have also represented unhoused folks in other cities in Oregon. And they told me that they believe Wilson's overnight shelters aren't a reasonable alternative, aren't, what I said, the reasonable shelter for folks who would otherwise be sleeping outside. They also said that they're staying in touch with people living outside who might be impacted by the enforcement, which suggests that they might be thinking about eventual litigation. I think that, it's so interesting how so much of this just comes down to the term reasonable and reasonableness and how vague and undefined it is, both at the state level and locally.
Absolutely. That's something that's sort of bedeviled people in Salem, too, I know. This has been going on for 6 days at this point. I assume we're getting a slow rollout. We will know, presumably, much more soon about how this is shaking out. Before I let you both go, though, I think we'd be remiss not to note that there was an election in Oregon this week. Not super exciting stuff, but I suspect for some library officials, some parks officials, very exciting stuff. Alex, one proposal you covered here in Portland passed.
Yeah, that was the Portland Parks Levy. That's a 5-year property tax that goes to parks programming, classes, some maintenance. It wasn't certain where voters would fall on this because it hiked the original property tax rate by 75%. And rising taxes is a perennial gripe for Portland homeowners. At the same time, voters have had a lot of distrust in the Parks Bureau due to years of poor financial planning that have led to this massive maintenance backlog within parks, a lot of kind of crumbling community centers and playgrounds. But at the end of the day, people love parks. It passed. I should note that the levy won't address the maintenance backlog. It will keep the Bureau from cutting its budget in half and laying off hundreds of people, but it's just kind of triaging the situation.
Yeah, not really what you want to hear when you've approved a pretty large tax hike, but here we are. Holly, you also covered some stuff out in Washington County. What was happening out there?
So voters in Washington County appear to be passing 2 levy measures. One is a renewal and increase of the current library measure that funds nearly half of the county's library expenses. The other is also a renewal and increase of the public safety levy. So both will result in an increase in property taxes, but like in Portland, where people love parks, people seem to love libraries and public safety. The public safety levy, I should mention, will go towards things like jail staff, assistance for domestic violence victims, and mental health response.
People in this part of the world, since I've lived here, have been very generous, have almost always approved tax increases for things like this. I think the question was this year, is that fading? And at least in Portland and Washington County, it is not. So I think let's leave it there. Thanks, both of you, for joining me today. This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks as always for your support, and thanks for listening.
Thank you.